Hi there, Read 536. This is Dr. Keisler, and welcome to week 10. This week, we're going to be spending some time focused on the best practices in reading instruction in different areas of literacy that we are interested in. So, the reason that we're going to just focus on one area of best practice is because you're going to have to choose that area for your triangulated analysis. So, depending on which area of literacy you want to focus on will depend on which video resources you watch this week. But I wanted to give us kind of an overview of best practices and some background on what we mean when we talk about best practices, because it's probably a term that you hear quite frequently and that you may even use quite frequently yourself. And for sure, when we took Read 508, we talked a lot about best practice, and you're probably talking a lot about best practice now in Read 507. So what is a best practice? The term best practice is used to describe kind of what works in a particular situation, right? Or a particular environment. We usually tend to think of it as this what works practice. When data can support the success of a practice in terms of research and data that's been collected on a practice, then we usually refer to it as a research-based best practice or a scientifically based practice, or in education, sometimes you also hear called evidence-based best practices. So, as good consumers of information, we should keep in mind that a particular practice that has worked for somebody within a given situation or a given environment may or may not yield the same results in a different educational situation or different educational environment. But still, regardless, we have defined sets of practices as these research-based best practices. So these days in education, when you hear the term best practice, really what they're likely to be referring to is this idea of what works based on research. So we come to this idea now of evidence-based teaching. So it wasn't kind of always this way in education, and those of you who taught or were in the classrooms before the advent of No Child Left Behind, so pre-2000, 2001, probably remember a time where we didn't necessarily talk about evidence-based teaching. We've been doing a lot of research in education before No Child Left Behind, but the idea of research-based best practices and evidence-based teaching really came about as a result of the emphasis on educational research and using programs that were scientifically based after the advent of No Child Left Behind. So kind of before, when you had the various efforts to reform schools, research really played a pretty minor role as compared to the role that it plays today. There were lots of untested innovations, you could say, that were often come onto the scene, were widely embraced, and then they would just kind of disappear as folks would start to use them, and kind of these unrealistic claims that they made about improving student achievement, or in our case, improving reading achievement, really failed to materialize. So this is where you get that idea or that sentiment in education of the pendulum kind of always swinging back and forth. So we were in this phase for a very long time of using these unscientifically tested innovations, seeing how they worked, discovering that they didn't necessarily work, and when we would just go ahead and replace them with kind of unequally untested innovations that were opposed in their philosophy. So kind of a lot of that back and forth that we read about in terms of the reading wars, there wasn't necessarily tons of evidence to support one side or the other at the time when the wars were being waged. And so as you heard and as we read about, this kind of led to us getting to the point where Clinton finally said, okay, let's really figure out what's going on, and let's spend some of our time and money and resources in trying to quantify what best practices actually are. So that Comprehensive School Reform Act in 1997 wanted to push schools to adopt kind of proven comprehensive reform designs and strategies. And so this idea with the word proven being in there meant that they wanted schools to start using programs that had been evaluated in scientifically based research. So this new emphasis was on looking at the innovations that we were going to implement and seeing, was there a way that we could determine whether or not they were actually working? And so could we turn to research to gather empirical evidence that would help us decide whether or not these were working? So that's in 1997. Fast forward a few years, we get to No Child Left Behind. We have the report of the National Reading Panel come out right before that. And for the first time, there's really this renewed emphasis on this idea of evidence-based teaching. And in fact, No Child Left Behind mentions, in quotations, scientifically based research 110 times in reference to their discussions on the Reading First program, Early Reading First, any of the Title I school improvement programs. They mention that phrase 110 times. So that is at the time a new thing in education, and it's pretty significant in the fact that it really marked this shift into this era of evidence-based teaching. And indeed now, even if you take a look on the Common Core State Standards site, our California site, or you look at the Clearinghouse site, one of the very first things in the bulleted description of how the Common Core were developed or what the Common Core are, the first bullet point is research-based practices, right? So Common Core State Standards are continuing this idea of using best practices that are based on research. So we've kind of touched on this discussion a little bit, but so outside of just being based on research, what is evidence-based teaching? So this idea of evidence-based teaching says that the practices, the best practices that are prescribed or described, need to be supported by valid research. And so the Department of Education, and you read about some of this when you read Yatvin's criticism of the report of the National Reading Panel, but the Department of Education essentially defined what constitutes valid research. So they said that the research that you examine should have a few of these things. So it should have control groups. And you'll learn more about this in 511 that you're going to take in the fall, but a little bit of a precursor to that. So with control groups are considered a hallmark of valid scientifically based research in education programs, right? So they use a control group. In a good study, by this definition, researchers would compare, several schools using a given program with several schools who are not using that program, right? But those schools would potentially, or should in a good study, share similar demographic information, similar prior performance, and preferably even be located in the same school district and same area. So when you think about the size of a group for your research, you would say, let's say, 5 schools in your experimental group and 5 schools in your control group. If you had a study that had an experimental group and it had a control group and it had about 5 schools in each, that would be considered having a valid design for the purpose of research that you would use to try to determine evidence-based teaching. So the reason a control group is so important is because in research design, what the control group attempts to do is provide the researchers some kind of estimate of what students in the experimental program would have achieved if they had been left alone, right? So that's why you want to try to make the control group as similar to the school who's getting the intervention or the experiment as possible. So you give a school a program, you let them implement it, or you give them a set of practices, you let them implement it, you see what happens. When you have that control group that, looks pretty similar to the experimental group, that school who's not getting the treatment, you look at what their results were at the end. And if there's, a difference, you would assume that there was something about the intervention that made that difference. So there's also an indicator for what is considered valid research for determining evidence-based teaching would be this idea of the research design being randomized or the study being a matched study. So I talked about this idea that your control group should be pretty similar to the experimental group, right? You want them to be similar in demographics and performance on a bunch of other indicators. So the most convincing form of a control group comparison study is a randomized experiment. So in a randomized experiment, students, teachers, and schools are assigned by chance to the group. So it's by chance that they would either be in the control group or in the experimental group, right? So let's say, talking about the idea of having 5 schools in each study again, if the principals and the teachers at 10 schools express that they would have an interest in using a particular reading intervention program, you would want to, pair those schools up to be as similar as possible. And then let's say you could flip a coin to see which groups were in the control group and which schools ended up in the control group and which schools ended up in the experimental group. So kind of at its most basic form, that's what a randomized experiment is. So randomized experiments are actually pretty rare in educational research. They're difficult to do because you need to control for lots of different factors and variables and essentially differences in the schools and in the students, because we're dealing with people, right? We're not dealing with widgets, or we're not dealing with a bunch of lab mice. So they can be very difficult to do. So instead, often what you see are these matched studies. So matched studies are far more common than the randomized one. And essentially, what you do with a match study is you look at all of those different indicators like demographics or achievement or poverty level, whatever it is that you're interested in trying to control for, and you find schools that are similar there, and then instead of randomly flipping the coin, you purposefully put one school in the control group and one school in the experimental group. So let's say that I had 10 schools. I wouldn't want to just go ahead and flip my coin and decide who's in the experimental group and who's in the control group, because let's just say that by chance a lot of schools in my experimental group ended up already from the beginning having slightly higher performance, or they ended up being on a lower, the students were from had lower socioeconomic status by chance. So in order to try to control for that chance, because I have perhaps a smaller number in my sample, what I can do is take those 10 schools and try to match them into 5 different pairs. And then I take those 5 different pairs and I assign one to the experimental group and one to the control group, right? So if this is a little confusing, don't worry about it because we're going to go over this much more in depth when we get to 511 next semester. But I'm trying to give this to you now so you understand kind of where this idea of evidence-based, scientifically based research and best practice is coming from. So another kind of hallmark of what constitutes valid research would be this idea of generalizability, and that is that the findings are applicable to the target population that the study was attempting to look at. So if the study looked at struggling readers, all of the criteria about the way the study was designed should allow you to believe that the results and the findings of this study are generalizable to other struggling readers, right? So one of the things that they tend to look at is this idea of sample size, where there are enough schools or enough students in this study to make the claim that this is indeed generalizable. And so we call that ecological generalizability. So again, you'll learn more about that next semester. And then lastly, they want to make sure that the studies that qualify for valid research under this evidence-based teaching exploration show statistical significance. So statistical significance just means that a quantitative analysis of the data or the results in the study prove that there's a statistically significant difference between the achievement of the students in the experimental group and the students in the control group. So the usual criterion is usually just p is less than 5, which just means that the probability is less than 5% that the observed difference might have happened by chance. So you figure this out through kind of some not so complicated and some complicated statistical analysis. So the idea here, again, with statistical significance, just like with generalizability and just like really with the idea of having the control groups, that they want to see that these studies can be replicated and that they involve a pretty large or robust number of students or schools in the study, because the chance of your study being able to prove statistical significance increases with your sample size, right? So the more students you have in the study, the less the chance is that the differences, if you indeed show or demonstrate differences, it's less likely that they happen by chance the more students you have in the sample or the more schools that you're looking at. So it's difficult, again, to have a single study that involves lots and lots of schools. So what they tend to do then is look at many studies that have smaller sample size and see if they kind of came to similar conclusions. So if you have lots of studies that were done by many researchers in a variety of locations, and they all show that there's some evidence that a program or a practice is working, this kind of adds to the confidence that indeed this practice or this program is valid. So lots of educational research develops in this way. So rather than evaluate one large definitive study, researchers usually look at lots and lots of small studies that potentially have flaws in different ways. But if you look at lots of studies, these flaws can kind of balance each other out. And if they continue to find these more consistent effects, then that may indeed demonstrate that all of the studies are producing some kind of meaningful conclusion or coming to some kind of meaningful conclusion. All right, so why did I just spend about 15 minutes probably boring you to tears and making you afraid of taking 511 now with all this talk about research? it's because we hear so much that, this practice is scientifically based. We want to see evidence-based teaching. This program or these practices have been determined best practices by research. So I want you to have an understanding of what that research says. I also would like you to have an understanding of if this or these are the set of qualifications that all of the research used, let's say in the National Reading Panel, had to pass, and you've done a little bit of research in education, you probably realize that there aren't necessarily, all studies can't pass this in educational research, because we deal with students again, and not widgets and not lab mice, but we deal with students and we deal with teachers and we deal with real lives. We have a huge body of research called qualitative research in education, and in all social science fields. So qualitative research won't necessarily, or does not, meet this set of criteria. Therefore, it was excluded, or it is excluded from the conversation about what constitutes research-based or evidence-based teaching. On the other hand, there's quantitative research, which all this is, that also isn't included. And so those would be quantitative studies which are considered to have weaker experimental designs, such as a single subject or a pre and post test design. So there were lots of studies that were excluded from the discussion about what constitutes scientifically based when we were trying to determine what all the best practices were. And like you read about in Yatvin's piece, when we were trying to figure out what those best practices are in literacy instruction and what constitutes being research-based, there were lots of studies and lots of things that were excluded. So just as a refresher, some of the things that were excluded specifically from what was deemed research-based and part of best practice for the report of the National Reading Panel were any studies that specifically addressed outcomes for ethnic minority students, any studies that specifically addressed outcomes for English language learners, any studies that specifically addressed outcomes for speakers of non-standard dialects of English, any studies that focused on the influence of motivation, and any study that was not a strong quantitative experimental design. And so that includes all correlational research, all ethnographic research, and all case studies. And so if you've done a little bit of research for other reports or papers that you've had to write in this program or other programs so far, you know that there are lots and lots of case studies out there. Case study is a popular form of research. So all of this was kind of deemed unscientific because it is not experimental. And so the slide before listed what constitutes experimental research. So I just wanted you to have this awareness, because when you do read that something is research-based, or you read that something is a best practice, you should know that how they're defining best practice and how they're defining research-based is really looking at a relatively small sliver of what's out there in terms of education research. It's not to say that we shouldn't think that these best practices are best practices, or it's not to say that a lot of the case studies or the correlational or ethnographic research shows completely opposite findings. I just share it so that you can be aware as that critical consumer that when it says research-based, they don't necessarily mean all research. They mean a particular kind of research. And so the last point I would like us to make there is this idea of scientifically based versus rigorously evaluated. So there has been an attempt in this discussion of best practices to promote programs That originally, if you think back to the language of that Comprehensive School Reform Act in 1997, their original hope was to have schools use programs that had been proven because they had been rigorously evaluated in scientifically based research. That proved to be very difficult, very expensive to do, as a lot of true experimental design scientific research is very expensive to do, which is why you don't see necessarily as much of it as you might see of case studies or some of the qualitative methods. But we found out that being able to select programs that were rigorously evaluated really left us with virtually no programs to choose from. So this idea of scientifically based was developed. And what scientifically based means is exactly what it sounds like. That the programs that schools can choose and use and implement and have these elements of best practice in them should be created or developed with all of these best practices in mind, and they should include the best practices from research, but the program itself has not been evaluated. So let's say that when we first all adopted OpenCourt or Houghton Mifflin, those were scientifically based programs, which meant they incorporated all of the best practices as outlined and addressed in the report of the National Reading Panel, but the efficacy of OpenCourt itself and how they put it together and how it was designed and how it was implemented was never evaluated. So there was no long-term longitudinal study that proved using OpenCourt or using Houghton Mifflin was going to get you the results that the research they were based on produced, if that makes sense. So they are based on the scientifically based best practices and they incorporate them, but the programs themselves, as they are put together and packaged, have not or were not at the time of implementation evaluated themselves. So no one had proved that indeed using OpenCourt would get you the results that the research claimed, because there was no research that had been done on the implementation of OpenCourt or on the implementation and use of Houghton Mifflin. In fact, one of the only programs that met the benchmark or the standard of being rigorously evaluated was Success for All. And lots of schools did implement that, but lots of schools also chose not to and instead purchased these big commercial programs. And so they are scientifically based, but they have not been rigorously evaluated. And kind of as a side note, I know that we read an article earlier about the effects of the Reading First program. Well, when the Department of Education said that you needed to use a scientifically based reading program if you were going to use the Reading First funds, they gave a list of 24 programs that had what they called research backing, which were scientifically based. And kind of the interesting thing is that, like I said before, only Success for All, and actually as an intervention, Reading Recovery, they were the only ones who actually met the benchmark of being also rigorously evaluated and had actual data that showed that they had positive or potentially positive effects on student achievement or on reading achievement in all of the major areas outlined by the report of the National Reading Panel. They did, well, Success for All didn't even make the list of the 24 programs that you can use. Reading Recovery was the only one that was on that list, and none of the most popular commercial programs had met that benchmark of rigorously evaluated, yet they were included in the list of the 24 programs that you could choose if you were going to implement reading first. And then, as we know now, the research has or the evaluation of the efficacy of the reading first program has indeed shown us that it really didn't make any difference. So just having a program that's scientifically based doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to produce the results that the research it was based on, or the conclusions that the research it was based on came to. So the programs themselves, to really have full faith and backing in them, should be rigorously evaluated, right? Not just scientifically based. So this gets us to best practice. So moving forward, I like this quote from Russ Whitehurst that kind of, to me, gives us a kind of a better way to conceptualize what a best practice is. And he says it's the integration of professional wisdom with the best available empirical evidence in making decisions about how to deliver instruction. What I personally like about this quote is that he says, yes, we should look at science, but you need to look at that best available empirical evidence, so the best available data that we have and the best available research that we have. And then we need to integrate that with what teachers know, right? What do the academics and what do the teachers who teach, what does their professional wisdom tell us? We need to bring these two together to make those decisions about how we deliver instruction. So in the chapters that we are going to read, and I'm specifically referring to the best practices in literacy instruction for the K-12 here, they spend about 2 pages talking about what best practice is. And so the way that they put this book together was to get in touch with or invite the best known names in the field for that particular area of literacy. So some of the best known names in vocabulary instruction, the best known names in comprehension instruction, the best known names when dealing with struggling readers, with English language learners. And they asked for them to give their advice on what best practice is. So each of these chapters includes that empirical evidence, but it also includes the judgment and the professional wisdom of folks who have spent their life doing this research, studying this, dealing with teachers and schools and kids. So when they talk about best practice in this chapter, that's what they're referring to. They also, and it's Nell Duke who writes the 2 pages, the foreword in the book. She also presents this idea that no matter what the best practice is, it hinges on effective implementation, right? So you could take a recommendation for a best practice, and this is exactly what happened with all, the programs that didn't produce the results they were supposed to. You can take a best practice, you can stick it in there, but if you don't implement it effectively or you don't use it the way it was intended, it's not going to give you the results that you desire, right? And then the last piece in her definition or description of best practice that I think is important is this idea that what best practice is changes over time. And so the reason that it changes over time is because we're constantly doing new research. So folks are always out there, they're always studying things, they're always looking at things, they're always innovating. And so we will learn new things about all of the best practices that they talk about and describe in this chapter, and that we have to be open to that, knowing that indeed these things change and that they are fluid. So generally, you're not going to find, though, anymore, since we are looking at research, that they go back and forth. So this idea of the pendulum swinging is probably going to be something that was more characteristic of educational reform in the past. So you'll see things change a lot, but I don't know that the pendulum will indeed, swing from doing something one way to doing it completely the opposite way. So bear all of this in mind as you're reading the chapter and as we're thinking about best practices over the next couple of weeks and as we move into our discussion of best practice for our triangulated analysis. So make sure that this week you read the chapters that apply to your area of literacy instruction and that you view the video resources that apply to your area of literacy instruction. So have a great week.